Good evening. Warm welcome to this year's Sir Denis Rooke Memorial Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Neil Atkinson. I'm the Chief Executive of IGEM, the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers. And I'm very proud and looking forward to having a very exciting evening talking about the future of the gas industry, because we are going through changes, aren't we? I personally have known Judith for a number of years, encountering her first when she became president of the Institution of Chemical Engineers, my own discipline. She's a true professional. She does know a little bit about gas. Judith and I have walked through, I think, one of the biggest gas production facilities on the planet in Ras Laffan in Qatar. So be warned. She's very passionate, I think, about diversity and the role of women in engineering. She's passionate about safety qualifications, something that's important to us. She and I did quite a bit of work around a professional process safety engineer qualification some years back, because there was some skepticism of the quality of some individuals on some registers, and therefore getting people well qualified against the correct competency set is absolutely vital. For those who are only my connections, Judith's career, she's going to talk to us about. There's one thing I must mention, though. We talk about safety. We talk about regulation. What we rarely talk about is people. It took the tragedy of 167 deaths in the North Sea with Piper Alpha to kick the industry into gear to sort out appropriate regulations through the Cullen Report in the North Sea. 72 people died at Grenfell, and that was just recently, as we all know. And the challenge there is to create the solution so that never, ever happens again. And as you all know, Dame Judith has been very much involved with that process. So can I invite Dame Judith to come and address us? And she's got a wonderfully combative title for the talk. So Denis, we'll be pleased of you, Judith. Take the blinkers off.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you very much indeed. And I have to say that it's a real honour and privilege to deliver this lecture this evening. So, like Neil, I've done some research on Sir Denis Rooke as well. Read through a lot of material on the internet, and interestingly, I think I must have read a different obituary to the one that you read. But the things that I picked out in there and which really struck me in the present times in which we live were, in the obituary that I read, it said he was a particular enemy of cant, particularly in political spheres. And it's difficult to imagine what he would make of the situation we find ourselves in today, I suspect, as a result of that. But the other comment was that he was renowned for his blunt forthrightness. Well, I think that's probably something that we share. I have been known to be fairly blunt and fairly forthright. It's not uncommon for people to describe me as straight talking, and you'll get some of that straight talking this evening. So I hope that I will at least go some way towards honouring his memory in that respect. So as you've heard from Neil, the title of my talk to you this evening of this lecture is about taking the blinkers off. And I chose this title with care and after considerable thought and discussion with Neil about the types of areas we might cover. What you will find by the time we get to the end of this lecture is that even the title has several implications. One, it's a message to engineers. It's a message to all engineers about looking beyond our own discipline, about thinking more broadly about where we are and what we do and why we do it, and what our real purpose is in the role that we perform. But it's also a message more broadly for society, because one of the things that will come through in this presentation is that those of us who think like engineers and see things as complex systems find it more and more difficult to operate in a world that wants quick fixes and simple solutions. So part of the message also is about how do we get other people to take those blinkers off and to think more broadly about some of the challenges that we face. And also, my talk is about bringing together all the things that I've learned throughout my career and how that came then to be applied to this review that I was asked to do by the government 2 years ago. So let's quickly get through the background story. I'm not going to tell you about my whole life history, I can assure you it's far, far too long. But I think it is quite important to refer to some of the milestones that I think have made quite a big difference to the way I think, the way I see things, and some of the behaviours that I've observed, and indeed some of the career choices that I've made as a result of that. So as you heard, I'm an engineer, a chemical engineer. I did my chemical engineering degree in the early 70s. And that was particularly important in many respects. Neil has already referred to Piper Alpha, but for me, it wasn't Piper Alpha that changed my outlook on safety. It was Flixborough. So when I was at university in the early 70s, Flixborough happened in the summer of 1974. An explosion that changed people's perception and certainly changed my perception about the industry that I was just about to join as a graduate engineer. So, by the time I joined the industry in 1975, the way in which we were expected to operate as process engineers out there in industry was already starting to change. And I want to be very specific about what some of those changes were. The one thing that Flixborough had taught all of us in every industry, in every company in those process industries, was that the days when you could just make a change on the back of a fag packet or a bit of paper had gone and gone forever. It was really important that any change you make to any chemical process is properly engineered, properly reviewed, and the integrity of the system is thought about. Sadly, as we know, more than 40 years on, we don't always learn those lessons once and learn them for good. We sometimes have to be reminded. So Piper Alpha was a reminder of that, as was Texas City, as was Macondo, and certainly in the industry sector that I've been part of for most of my working life, it's always been a source of great frustration for me that we seem to go through these cycles where we think we've fixed it, and then we have to learn a lesson the hard way again, so we go back and we go, got to get back on the case again, got to get back on that particular case. So I've always felt a certain sense of frustration that we say we learn lessons, and to some extent we do, but then over time our memory fades, and for whatever reasons we move on to other things. But having said all of that, having worked in the major hazard industries for more than 25 years at the start of my career, it was never in any doubt to me that safety was an integral part of being part of the chemical and oil and gas and petrochemical industries. So when I moved on from being involved in frontline operations management and doing things as I did, like preparing safety cases as a duty holder, and all of that for chlorine and bromine and goodness knows what else, facilities that we were running at Fawley, where I worked at the time, and then moving on into representing the industry, I also saw an industry that tended to see things with blinkers on. So here's my first example of blinkers. When I went to the CIA, in my case, the Chemical Industries Association, in the late 1990s, it was just at the time when lots of people were getting very concerned about the environmental fate of chemicals. And people were saying, I'm really worried about chemicals. What are they doing to my health as a consumer? What happens to all of these chemicals in the environment? And the industry's response at the time was I shouldn't laugh about this because it's quite serious, but the response was, it's fine. We have a 0.02 safety performance on this plant and that plant. Our safety performance is excellent. To which people would respond, not unsurprisingly, that's not the point. That's not the question. I'm not asking you if you are safe in your factory. I'm asking you whether the products of your industry are safe for me as a consumer. And we were not doing terribly well at answering those questions. That's why we ended up with a major piece of regulation in the form of REACH, where the European system said, this is not good enough, you have to get on, you have to assess these chemicals, and you have to answer those questions. So when you don't do the right things voluntarily, you end up being regulated and made to do it. Some of these things will recur in the course of this speech. So then, after I'd worked for some time representing the industry, representing the chemical industry, both here in the UK, I became Director General of the Chemical Industries Association. Then I went to Brussels and worked for the European chemical industry for a while. And then I came back in 2007 to chair HSE. I was very clear when I took on that role that there were several reasons for it. One, I was already very clear that we had a very good regulatory system here in the UK. In fact, I've said many times over the decades that I was chair of HSE, we had and have the best regulatory system in the world for health and safety, and that is proven by years of good performance as a result of that. Can always be better, of course, but compare us with any other country in the world, and we have an extremely good regulatory system that delivers good outcomes. And it focuses on the real risks. But one of the challenges I faced when I went into HSE in 2007 was reclaiming that ground, which was where HSE really stood at a time when the general public thought HSE was all about banning conkers and flower baskets and goodness knows what else. And I had to get people back into it. No, that's not what this is about. This is about an organisation that is there to ensure that people go home at the end of every working day, no matter what industry they work in, safe and unharmed as a result of the work that they do. So that was my near decade in HSE. I stepped down from HSE in 2016. I didn't put on the slippers just yet. I took on a number of other roles, including chair of EEF, now Make UK, the manufacturers organisation, and also involved in the Catapult network, so in non-exec positions and so on. So very much sticking with my engineering roots. But certainly, when I left HSE in 2016, I presumed that I was in for a easier and quieter time. And then in June 2017, I, like most of you, woke up to the news on the TV of the dreadful incident that had happened at Grenfell. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I remember very clearly saying to my husband, I don't understand this. I really don't understand how we have arrived at a position where the regulatory system has allowed that to happen. Surely our regulatory system is better than that, I said. and then we went to France on holiday. And while we were in France, I got a call from the Secretary of State, completely out of the blue, to say, would I conduct an independent review of building regulations and fire safety in relation to high-rise buildings. I didn't think about it for very long. Some would say I should have done. But for me, this was very personal, and this was about, I want to understand what went wrong here. I really do want to understand how such a tragic incident kind of happened, and if I can do anything to make the system better for the future, then I do want to do that. So on that basis, I said yes, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I was invited to conduct an independent review in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire. But the remit, and I think it's really important to be clear about this, and there are several reasons why we need to be clear about this, is that this is not a review of Grenfell Tower. This is a review of the regulatory system that has allowed many other buildings to be built that are substandard. Because what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire is that a series of surveys were done, commissioned by the government to look at the state of other buildings, in the hope, the vain hope, I think, that Grenfell would prove to be a one-off, and we would find something very peculiar about what had happened at Grenfell that would say, that's it, that's the only building like that. But guess what? That's not what we found at all. Simply by looking at the cladding, simply by doing surveys of a number of high-rise residential buildings, we very quickly realized that there were several hundred high-rise residential buildings in the UK, in England and Wales, that were giving cause for serious concern, either because they had similar cladding systems and or because fire doors were not in place, ventilation systems were not as they should have been. All sorts of concerns in relation to fire safety came to the surface very, very quickly in a period of about 2 or 3 weeks. And it was that triggered my review. So the review was commissioned by the government, announced in July, and what I was asked to do was an end-to-end review of the regulatory system and the people who are part of that system. Now, I'm going to say more in a minute about what I mean by the regulatory system, because I think it's quite important, before I get too far in this presentation, that we all understand what I'm talking about, because it may not necessarily be what you think of when you think about regulatory system. But I was asked to look at buildings and fire safety. It's very much focused on high-rise residential buildings, not all buildings, high-rise residential buildings. I was asked to make recommendations that would ensure a robust and effective regulatory system for the future. Also, to look and see whether there were other people we could learn from. Was there somewhere in the world where this problem had already been tackled? Were there standards we could adopt from elsewhere in the world that would simply make us better, and do that quickly? But also, part of the remit was, and whilst you're doing all of that, steer clear of anything that's specific to Grenfell, that is part of the public inquiry, that is part of the criminal and police investigation that is ongoing, because no one would have thanked me for doing anything that would prejudice any of that, clearly. So I hope that gives you an idea of something that's a fairly challenging remit. Challenging in that it was an end-to-end review of the whole system. Challenging in that a number of other reviews were ongoing. There was an expert panel providing advice on what could and couldn't be used in remediation work that had already started, and the public inquiry had already been announced. But it was also challenging insofar as I was asked not simply to look at how do we make things better for the future in new build, but how do we make things better for the future in the existing building stock as well? So we simply could not say, well, we have what we have, but we'll get better as we build new. I had to look at how can we apply this retrospectively to buildings that are already out there. Why me? Well, I've asked myself that question many times. I think it was pretty simple, really. I'm not an expert in construction, so I didn't come to this with any preconceived notions of what is or what can't be changed. Yes, I'd spent a decade leading HSE, and as I said, I think that means I know what good regulation looks like. I'm not involved politically, but so I bring a level of independence and objectivity to the review, and I hope that that will show through in what I talk about as we go forward. So as I said, I want to start by getting us all on the same page in terms of what makes a good regulatory system. Because in those first few weeks when I started on this review, people expected me and were happy to hand over to me piles and piles of paperwork. People said, well, you'll want the regulations, won't you? And you'll want all the guidance. No. Really? No, I don't want all of that, because if you wanted someone who is going to turn shoulds and coulds into shalls and musts, it's a lawyer you need, not an engineer. I'm not going to read through the details of the regulation. That's not the way I roll, and that's not the way we're going to do this. We're actually going to look at how the system works, how it's supposed to work, and how it actually works in practice. Because a regulatory system is not there simply to set rules. A regulatory system exists to drive the right behaviours. It is about much more than what is written on paper in the rules and guidance. As Neil has already said, it will not work unless you have an effective regulator overseeing the system. It will not work unless there are incentives for doing the right thing and sanctions for those who do the wrong things. It needs to be clear on who is responsible, who is accountable, and it needs to be clear on what is expected of those who are responsible and accountable. That means it needs to be coherent. No ambiguity, no trade-offs in the system to be played one against the other. And something that I have learned and will defend unstintingly is the need for good regulatory systems to be outcomes-based, describing what is meant to be achieved, rather than regulatory systems that are driven by prescription. Because prescriptive regulatory regimes take responsibility away from the people who need to know that they are responsible and accountable, commonly known as box ticking. So that's what a good regulatory system needs to look like. So I started my review in July 2017, produced an interim report before Christmas in 2017, final report in May of last year. Lots and lots of engagement of stakeholders in that process. Talked to people in the regulatory regime, talked to people in industry, talked to people who lived in high-rise buildings, a whole host of people. Got them together in summits, so it was very much an interactive process of talking to people, and published the final report, as I said, in May of last year. So, report from start to finish in less than just over 10 months. And then in December of last year, although you may have missed it in all of the hullabaloo about other things, but the government did announce just before Christmas last year that they will implement my recommendations in full. And that work is ongoing, and we'll talk more about that later. But one of the small victories in all of that was that I said very clearly in my final report, do not cherry pick the recommendations that I am making in this report, because it is a systems solution. And if you implement it all, we can change the system. But if you cherry pick which recommendations you want to implement, you will not change the overall system. The fact that they have agreed to implement it in full, I think, means that that message was driven home and understood. So what did I find? Well, in short, a mess. Even at the interim report stage, it was very clear that we had a completely broken system. It didn't work in the way that it was supposed to work. And what was even more shocking to me was that people knew it. It didn't take me to come in and say, I think this system is broken. When I talked to people, they told me, this system is broken. It has been for a long time. We know that people are gaming the system. We know that people are finding ways around things. We've always known it. And this needs shaking up, and it needs to be sorted. There was little or no enforcement, an incredibly weak system. So the penalties involved here are so small as to be insignificant. So that gives every incentive for people who want to take shortcuts to give it a go. Because even if you get caught, which is very unlikely, the penalty is far less than the amount of money you can save in the cost savings that you will make by taking the shortcuts. An extraordinary system has developed in this industry in that the contractors and the people involved in the construction of residential buildings can choose their own regulator. How extraordinary is that? Not only can they choose them, they also pay them. So is it surprising that those privatized regulators in the building control sector, who have no enforcement powers either, so it tends to be a fairly weak and unregulated system where they're given advice, but they're not actually regulating, although they're called regulators. Industry behavior as a result of all of those things and lots of other things that I'll talk about later is all about seeing what you can get away with, taking every shortcut that's possible, gaming the system. There are conflicts of interest all over the place. The guidance is incredibly prescriptive. The regulations themselves are fairly simple, but then there's masses and masses of guidance that sits underneath the regulations. And that guidance is written in the most bizarre way. It's written in ways that there are 15 different sections to the guidance. And you can pick up one section of the guidance that tells you how to do structural design and structural safety. You pick up another set that tells you about how to do electrics, and another one that tells you about thermal efficiency, and another one that talks about noise abatement. Well, any one of you in this room who is an engineer will know that those things are not independent. They all interact together, and yet the guidance is written in ways that suggests they are completely independent of one another. And guess what? Because it's written in that way, that's how people behave. So they look at one bit of it, blinkers, and they comply with that bit, and they don't think about the broader consequences. So that was the start. But it didn't end there, because the engineer who has spent all of her career working in the major hazards industry then started to ask questions about some pretty basic things. So, who approves the design of this high-rise building now? Which design? Well, the design that you must have to have approved before you build the building. Well, we have an outline design when we start, but then we let design and build contracts. Design and build contracts mean sketchy design and make the rest up as you go. Then you come across problems in the system where experts are involved. They're asked for their views on proposals and designs. The fire service is asked to give an opinion on a proposed design. They are a statutory consultee in the regulatory process. But there is no requirement for people to take any notice of what they say. So you ask them for their advice, but then you're under no obligation to take any action on what they say. So you shouldn't be surprised when the message to me from the fire service was, some of these buildings should never have been built. We never wanted them built the way they were built, but then we have to deal with fighting fires in those buildings as and when they occur. So there are huge problems to be addressed as part of this system. Problems that are associated with the culture of the construction industry, with the lack of building management, that lack of basic change management in a way that most of us in this room, I suspect, would understand and know is hugely important. And a need for proper regulation to be in place to ensure that this system works. Towards the end of the interim phase of my report, what I also came across and what also astonished me was the complete lack of any form of traceability in the building sector. So cars, food. If I have a car that has a problem, the manufacturer can contact me because they know that the part that is in my car is at fault and they do a product recall. The same is true of food. We all take it for granted that there is traceability in everything. Well, there is no traceability in construction. There is no way and nowhere that it is recorded what materials have been used on which job. So there is no traceability whatsoever in the system in terms of what has been used where. You have to ask yourself why. It's not rocket science. There are so many other sectors where we already do it, and yet in construction there is no system of traceability, and the way in which products are tested leaves a lot to be desired. So, when I sent this presentation to Neil, his first question was, "You're not going to talk people through that slide, are you, Judith?" No, I'm not. I'm not going to talk you through this slide. But what I am asking you to do in terms of looking at this is to see that this is what the current regulatory system for buildings looks like when it's looked at through the eyes of an engineer. All I want you to take from that is it really surprising it didn't work? When you've got something as complicated as that, there are so many nodes in there where, with an ineffective regulator and an industry that is intent on gaming the system, there are so many different modes of failure that it beggars belief. And incredibly complex. The other thing about that picture is that it's evolved over time. So I doubt very much that it started off looking like that. But this is what happens when you make changes to regulation without thinking about the whole system. That you hang bits on here and you take bits off here, and you end up with something that looks A, complicated, and B, doesn't actually work in practice. So by the time I got to my final report, it was pretty clear to me what was needed in terms of fundamental reform to this whole system. It goes back to what makes good regulation. Clear accountability, a stronger regulator, and a single regulator. We had and have today several different regulators looking at different things here. You've got HSE already involved in construction, looking at how the building is being built through the lens of, are the workers going to be safe while they're building this? And is it going to be safe for workers to maintain this building once it's built? You've got a different regulator looking at fire regulations and another one looking at whether or not the building is okay structurally and all of that in the form of the building inspectors. So for the future, what I have recommended and what is going to be implemented is the formation of a joint competent regulator that will bring all of those things together and will look at all of those things at the same time. Now, does this start to sound familiar and a bit like the chemical industry, who were looking at safety through the lens of our workforce are safe, when the issue they were being asked about was, are the products safe? Some of the same stuff was going on here. One regulator looking at the safety of the workforce, nobody really looking long and hard at whether the safety of the people who lived in that building were going to be okay in the long term. So we need a stronger regulator in place with better tools in their tool bag. Incentives for the people who do the right thing and stronger sanctions for those who do the wrong things. Holding duty holders to account, and also picking up on a similar process that we operate in other industries and one that you will be familiar with in the gas industry, which is the higher the risk, the more attention you pay to the management of that risk. And so in the highest risk, high-rise buildings, they are going to be subject to a safety case type of regime that will require people to demonstrate that what they want to build is safe, to demonstrate that what they have built is safe, and then once buildings are in occupation, that they are maintained and operated in a way that continues to keep them safe for the people who live in them. So clear responsibilities to continue to manage that on an ongoing basis. We also have to treat residents in these buildings with the dignity and the respect that they deserve. They have not been listened to. They have had no formal means of raising their concerns, and that needs to change, and change in a very big way. The guidance needs to be written in a very different way. As I said, the prescriptive approach and this siloed approach to different aspects of guidance has got to change, because that doesn't make any sense at all. And what starts to come through in this final point here about getting industry involved in writing the guidance is we've got to get the construction industry out of this mindset of, I'll do what I'm told. Because what that actually means is that they take a view that says, if the rules don't say I can't do it, then I will assume that I can. That is not a responsible behaviour. That is not a responsible practice. So we've got to raise the level of responsibility. That means we need people in this sector who are more competent than they are today. And if they are not competent, then they need to be supervised by someone who is competent, who will check their work until they are competent. And we need, not surprisingly, to also address this issue of traceability of products, because it is inexcusable to me that people cannot tell you what materials they've used where. The complexity of trying to find which buildings had what cladding on it after Grenfell was unbelievable, because no one knew. So they had to take samples off every building and send them to BRE to be tested to see what they were, because no one had recorded it. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of the specifics to do with this review. I'll move on to the more broader lessons that I think come out of this. Because there are some key principles here that I think are really, really important. One of them is about looking at things as systems. They are complex systems. Buildings are complex systems. It is not a series of independent bits that you've put together and hope that it works. We need to have accountability and responsibility in the system. We need to have culture change. We need risk-based approach, a proportionate approach to the highest risks. We don't need to apply this process to two-bedroom semis, but we do need a process for buildings where several hundred people are all going to live on top of one another and where they can make changes just like anyone else, but which impact upon many other people, not just themselves. And we need an outcomes-based framework. What's really interesting is that if you do all of those things and you bring the regulators together, you can actually produce a much stronger and more robust regulatory system, but it's nowhere near as complex as the one that we have today. So this is the proposed new regulatory system. Much, much simpler, but a lot tougher than the one that we have today. So, big step in the right direction, but this is about culture change. This is about getting an industry to get out of its current mindset of we're fragmented, nobody takes responsibility, we do everything as cheaply as possible and walk away and let someone else worry about the problems after we've moved on. We've got to get to a position where there's more collaboration, more partnership, and real ownership of the purpose of buildings is to provide buildings that are safe for people to live in, not how can we get out of here and make a fast buck as quickly as possible. That's the heart of the change we have to drive. So as I said, where are we so far? Recommendations are going to be implemented in full. Don't ask me when. That's like asking me when we're going to leave the EU, because we have to do that first and then we can move on to changing the building regulations. But a lot of support, lots of support. After that initial reaction on the day that the report was produced of people saying, well, it's just about cladding, isn't it? No, it's not about cladding. It's about a much bigger issue than cladding. People have started to get this idea that we have to change the system. There's an industry safety steering group in place which is trying to drive that culture change in the industry, which I'm chairing. And there is a portfolio board, a cross-government portfolio board that is really driving all of the changes that need to be made to the regulatory system and addressing the historic problems associated with this. We've also banned cladding, again, because nobody took any notice the first time, so we've banned it again, just to make sure. Interestingly, we've got some early adopters in the industry who are saying, we know this needs to happen, and we want to be in the forefront of it. But believe me, there's not enough of them yet. Not enough of them by any means. There is also a good deal of interest in government in thinking more broadly about this approach to looking at regulation, because it does lead to a very different approach to better regulation. With apologies to people who are here from Bays, I think 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 2 out, 1 in, 3 out was one of the most ridiculous approaches to regulation that we've ever had, because that is the sort of stuff that drives that kind of add a bit on here, take 2 bits off here, without looking at the system as a whole. What I hope will come out of this regulatory review here is a very different approach to looking at other regulatory regimes. But I do want to pick up now on this issue of failures in systems, because although I was asked at the start of this to look at the regulation and the regulatory system, it became very clear to me quite quickly in this review that there were several systemic failures going on here. One, undoubtedly, with the regulatory system, but also, as I said a few moments ago, a failure to recognise that buildings themselves are complex systems. But my question for you is, how many times do we forget that other things that we are involved in, whether it's gas networks or anything else, are also complex systems? And do we look at them in their entirety or not? Question. What I also know is that the system has failed in as much as things that have been bread and butter to me throughout most of my career, in terms of change management, safety case, HAZOP, and everything else that's to do with process safety, has failed completely to penetrate other sectors. So how come the way in which we look at processes in the gas and oil industries are looked at in one way, and we have failed to transfer that knowledge and that systemic thinking into other sectors. So just look at the regulatory system failure that I talked about. Separate regulations. Safety of the workforce, separate from everything else. Clients able to choose their regulator. No gateways in the process, and a system that's evolved without anyone looking at it in its entirety. And bizarrely, government and policymakers thinking they were being helpful by adding on more and more layers of prescription. How ridiculous is it that policymakers in Westminster are trying to second guess what trick the industry is going to pull next and tell them what they can and can't do? You cannot run an effective regulatory regime in that way. The building system failure. So just to highlight some of the examples of that and to think about what that means. As I said, siloed thinking, and this is where I start to worry about us as engineers and whether or not we do what we should do with our broader thinking hats on, as it were. Some of the examples that I came across of engineers looking at buildings with blinkers on and looking solely at one aspect of the building without considering another were shocking. Structural engineers who were called in to look at buildings and comment on their structural safety, and where the fire safety issues were clear for anyone to see, but they didn't look at them because that's someone else's job. That doesn't scan for me against a profession that talks a lot about ethics and our responsibility to society. That's one of the aspects of the blinkered thinking that really does concern me for our profession. I mentioned earlier a number of the other things on this slide about a total lack of discipline around designs not being properly approved, changes happening on the hoof also not being recorded, let alone being assessed in terms of whether or not they are the right thing to do, a lack of competence. Thinking that really to someone who's grown up with layers of protection and bow ties and all of those things that we all know about, to see some of the ways in which decisions are made about buildings really does beg belief to someone like me. High-rise buildings are built on the basis that every flat is a compartment, and that compartment will keep people safe in the event of a fire. That is a single layer of protection. What are the chances that people are going to do something that will impact the integrity of their own compartment? I'm asking you, what are the chances that someone's going to change their front door? Because that's all it takes to destroy the integrity of that compartment that is a critical safety feature of the building. This siloed thinking, I cannot tell you how far it goes. Buildings are divided into common parts. That means stairwells and lifts and landings, and compartments, which are the bits that people live in. So the Jimmy Green question is, and the walls? What are the walls? Are the walls common parts, or are they part of the compartment? They're not either. How is that? I don't know. I still don't understand. So many, many more. You can see all of these things. But now let's just take time to reflect. Is this new? No, it's not. One of the saddest things for me about doing this review was recognizing that so many of these things were familiar to me from my past and from things that I've seen go on in other sectors. Inadequate review of design and no assessment of inherent safety features. We've been there in this sector, in the sector that I worked in. We've learned that lesson in the past, but it still was going on in another sector that I encountered here. Fire risk assessments, focusing on the trivial and minor issues. fire risk assessments that said, take the doormats away from the front door because they're a tripping hazard in the event of a fire evacuation, but didn't look at the front doors themselves, which were absolutely critical barriers to fire. How many times do we do safety walkabouts in our industries and go, tripping hazard, hold the handrails, lids on coffee cups, without looking at the fundamental things that are the real issues? We all know examples and have all been guilty of doing those things ourselves. Failure to manage and review change, we've been there too. All of those things are examples where we say we've learned. Now we face a situation where another industry sector is having to learn those lessons and learn them the hard way. Silos of knowledge. Neil told you earlier that he and I worked extensively on introducing a new qualification in process safety for chemical engineers. Why only for chemical engineers? I don't know. It's certainly something I believe we should be sharing more broadly with other sectors. We've got sophisticated tools and techniques that we know how to use to assess hazards, to assess risks. We need to share them with other sectors. We haven't done that, and we haven't done it anywhere near enough in terms of making it relevant, making it applicable to other sectors where there are other risks to be managed and dealt with. And what's also sad to me is that nowhere have I found anyone who's cracked this problem. So this is an international problem. The same problems exist in construction pretty much everywhere in the world that I've looked at. There are pockets of good practice in terms of ways that regulations are written and so on, and standards that are set that we could learn from, but no one has cracked the systemic problem. So here's the bit about blinkers. We continue to fail to learn, we continue to fail to share our knowledge and look beyond disciplinary boundaries in making that happen. It was certainly true and became evident very quickly when I did this review that other buildings were a cause for concern. So-called solutions of fixing the wrong problems. So a good example of that for me is this whole debate about cladding. Everyone knew the answer to this problem was, well, if we just get rid of cladding, it will all be all right, won't it? No, it won't be all right. We will have fixed one problem, perhaps, but we will not have fixed the systemic problem. I've already mentioned my concern, and I think one that we all have to look at, about professionals not looking outside of their own area of expertise, and certainly not being prepared to call for other expertise when needed, and a real absence of leadership. So can we make a difference? And is this relevant to all of you? I'm sure it is. And I'm sure it is for many reasons. You come up against this built environment sector at one end, and you have learned some of the things from the process industries that sit at the other end of where you sit in this. There is a really important role that you can play, I am sure, to help us get that translation process going so that we don't have to rediscover all of these wheels in construction and they invent all of their own new tools when it is perfectly possible for us to translate what we already know and help them to get there. But that's not enough, because your own industry is also changing. And you also need to think how you're going to embrace that and think about things in a much broader and more systemic fashion as some of those changes come at you. I think we've got to get much better at interdisciplinary working. I think our university courses need to sit up and think about whether it's appropriate to teach some things to some engineers and not others. And some of the things that I believe are that things like systems thinking need to be common to every engineering discipline everywhere, because it's so fundamental. And we also have to focus on what we're all about. And if we continue to focus on this is my job and that's the only bit of my job, we won't get to the right answer, because what we're all here for and what engineering is all about is delivering safe solutions for society. And that's what we all need to focus on. So, I've talked a little bit already about this regulatory system failure. I think we can also address that, because I think we can look at regulation differently. And I think there are ways in which that can be applied to other regulatory systems, not just the one that I looked at. That mapping approach could be applied to anything. I would love for someone, not me, to map the national health system, because I am convinced that we could get to a better solution if we applied systems thinking to our national health system than simply calling for more doctors or more money or reduce waiting lists. We have to take a systems approach to fixing things and to creating better regulation. So I do hope that we can get away from what are either regulatory Christmas trees, or I've described in other fora as playing Jenga with regulations, one in, two out, whatever. We have to move the construction industry on to a place where their focus is on safe solutions for everyone, not just for the people they employ and they engage as contractors. We need to get this thinking out there that sometimes the solutions to problems are quite complex. And I don't underestimate the challenge of that, because we exist in a world where people want quick answers, fast solutions. In fact, quite a lot of the time, as I learned to my cost on this review, they already know what the answer is before you get there. And if you don't come up with the answer that they want, then it's your fault and you get a lot of flack because you didn't come up with the answer that they wanted to hear. But as I said, one of my key messages for an audience like this is, are we doing enough on cross-sector learning? I don't think so. I think we have to get that debate going and thinking about how we can learn lessons more broadly. So that really wraps up what I think we need to debate and think about: opening it up, taking those blinkers off, talking to one another, not taking the mindset that says that's someone else's problem, not mine, or that could never happen here, and all of those other behaviors that typify people who are operating with blinkers. Because the truth is that when these disasters happen, whether it's Grenfell or Piper Alpha or Flixborough or whatever else, it is engineers in general whose trust is being eroded and whose value to society is being chipped away at. This is a big challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity, and I'm convinced that we can do better and we can do a much better job. So that's why it's called Taking the Blinkers Off. Thank you for listening, and I hope I've given you something to reflect on your way home. Thank you.